I fell in love with reading at the age of 5, thanks to my mother's unwavering insistence that I read 3 pages of a book before I could go out and play. But she didn't just hand me the simple, cheerful tales of Dick and Jane. No, my mom made me read The Silver Skates by Hans Christian Andersen. A story rich with adventure, resilience, and the power of dreams. From those early pages, a spark was ignited. It was like an appreciation for the worlds that books could open. And over time, my love for storytelling deepened and expanded beyond fiction into the realm of nonfiction. Those true stories, the autobiographies and biographies, and then eventually investigative journalism. All of the above captivated me in a way no fiction ever could. Nonfiction, when it's done right, doesn't just inform, it really does fire my imagination. It allows me to walk into the author's shoes, to see the world that they're investigating through their eyes, and to wrestle with the truths they uncover. That's why investigative journalism holds a special place in my heart. It takes us beyond surface-level narratives. It demands that we confront uncomfortable truths, and more importantly, that we consider new perspectives. It's a craft that bridges the personal and the universal, and in doing so, it embodies the very essence of why I fell in love with reading. The power of words to shape how we see the world we live in.
There seems to be this notion, and this is what I hear at dinner parties, that we wake up in the morning and we throw a dart at the dartboard and say, I'm going to be an expert in this today, and this is what I think about it, and the story is filed by 3 o'clock. It's just not true. Not the big picture stuff.
My guest today is at the top of the investigative journalist game. He's a relentless seeker of the truth. He shines a light on the stories that matter.
Of the Panama Papers, some 11 million documents details how everyone from world leaders to a soccer superstar are tied to offshore bank accounts and shell companies used to hide wealth.
And there are some 300
stories that others try to keep in the shadows. As a multi-award-winning journalist, Robert Cribb has exposed corruption, shaped public discourse, and proven why investigative journalism matters now more than ever.
Fiction is lovely. I mean, it's so easy to post to the internet your reflections on something you know nothing about. You've taken zero time or effort to actually understand the complexity and sophistication of these issues and post about it and just say, here's what I think, and name names and point fingers. The problem is, it's fake.
In an age of disinformation and fleeting headlines, his work reminds us that uncovering the truth is not just a profession, it's a public service. And today we'll dive into what drives him, the challenges of his craft, and why investigative journalism remains the cornerstone, the bedrock of democracy.
That's not what you're getting when you're relying solely on a feed fed by algorithms that are reinforcing what you already think.
Please welcome to Chatter That Matters, the one and only Robert Cribb.
No, good to be here, man. Thank you.
Listen, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I'm always interested in human journeys. Like, what drew you into journalism, and what made you realize that investigative journalism, which is a lot more work, was going to be your calling?
It's interesting. I think like many Genesis stories, it was a girl. So I was doing a master's degree in English, and I was headed towards becoming, like an academic, writing papers about Canadian literature and Shakespeare. And I met this woman at university. I was totally infatuated with her, and I realized the only way I was going to spend time with her is if I joined the newspaper, because she was constantly doing interviews and writing stories, and she was busy she wanted to be a journalist, and I knew nothing about it, but I figured this is the only way I'm going to spend time with her. So I volunteered for the paper. I did this piece where the administration was threatening to spike tuition the next year by 10, 15%. It was crazy. And so I just did what I instinctively do with these things, is go to the data and the documents, and I looked at the budgets, and I found all these line items in the university budget that clearly implied some form of waste and duplication of services. And I just wrote a piece saying, look, if the university would just address all of these kinds of waste and duplication, maybe they wouldn't need to spike tuition so much. And then, the day the story published, I came to school, and there was this huge protest outside the student union building, and they're waving the story. And the president of the university called the newspaper and asked to meet with me. I just thought, this is insanity. Like, I've written dozens and dozens of academic papers and 4 people have read them. And in this one piece, suddenly there's all this engagement and public interest, and it's inspiring outrage and public discussion. And I think it was that moment where I just sort of fell in love with it. And I thought, what an incredible way to have direct, meaningful impact on matters of vital public importance.
What you've discovered at an early age is what I call cause and effect. You caused something that had an effect on others. And I feel like today, very often, we just punch things into the cloud. We really don't know what our impact is. We don't know that we're impacting change, emotion, happiness, sadness, or whatever. How much is that missing in society, which you found at an early age?
I mean, I think I was lucky. You know, so many of us, I have a daughter who's about the same age I was when that happened. And, you know, she's struggling. She's searching to find what the path is. And luckily, it happened to me early. And it was so profound and powerful for me. And I fell in love with it immediately, and I just immersed in it, and it became kind of a mission. And journalism really is kind of a calling. It is an indefensible professional path to take in almost every way. But for that sort of small minority of people who find a calling in it, I mean, it's been the greatest journey of my life. So, you know, I just count myself as one of the lucky ones who figured it out early enough to make a go at it.
I've talked to addicts before, and I often say to addicts, they always talk about that first moment when they discovered something and they spent the rest of their life searching for it again. Did you find out with this story that took you to a high that you've continued to chase? Or have you found that many times where your story has created such an impact that you get the same kind of validation and reward from it?
Yeah, I compare it to golf. When I golf, I hit the ball 100 times. 99 of those shots are terrible. But man, that one shot, when you hit it perfect onto the green, like, that's enough for me. And I'll come back. I will keep coming back for that. So it's an adrenaline hit when you get it right, when it lands right. Lots of frustration in the interim that we don't talk about. There's stories that I invested countless hours, months of time in, and I knew, like, instinctively, I thought this was so important and this is going to blow the lid off something. And it landed with a silent, soft thud that resulted in 2 emails from a reader and disappeared the next day. You just don't know.
I interviewed Megan Twohey from the New York Times, and she talked about investigative journalism. There's also a sense of adrenaline, because very often you're peeling back layers that people don't want peeled back. More often than not, you're putting a light on what people are trying to keep in the shadows. Do you feel that sense that when you're walking into an area that you know you're going to have opposition, and that might be something you're investigating, or it might be adjacency, other people that will be impacted by that story?
I mean, every time, yeah, particularly with investigative reporting. By virtue of the fact that you're doing an investigation at all is an indication that you have a hypothesis that there is something here to be investigated. So out of the gate, there is an adversarial element to it where you feel a government or an individual or a corporation is doing something that is contrary to the public interest and is deserving of public attention.
I love your analogy of the one shot in 100 that lands and keeps you going back. Curious, is there a story that you hold the highest, the hole-in-one story in your life that you go, that was such time well spent because of the impact it had on changing public discourse or opening up and exposing the truth?
In my career, the one that stands out obviously is the Panama Papers. I worked on the Panama Papers investigation with journalists around the world. 2017, I think, it was a huge investigation, a year-long project, journalists around the world looking at offshore movement of wealth from wealthy people around the world, kings, presidents, prime ministers, into offshore tax havens, removing their obligation to their national tax organizations. When it landed, I'll never forget that moment. It truly was like a nuclear bomb. It went off, and every major news organization from CNN to Al Jazeera to BBC was reporting the findings of this investigation, which had been conducted in secret. It immediately led to criminal charges, investigations into tax evasion that recovered, hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes to all these national tax coffers. And then, of course, it went on to win a Pulitzer Prize and stands as a legacy today in terms of the power of collaboration, in journalism and the power of working together and accessing through sources and confidential sources the kinds of data that can truly change the public conversation. But, there's other ones that for me are more personal. I after I became a dad, I became very interested in children's issues, and I started investigating protection of children because I felt this deep sense of vulnerability, including one investigation I'll never forget, which looked at how this Canadian guy and he had partners in Europe manipulated parents and children to isolate them, take photos of them, videos of them, and effectively create a global child pornography network where they were selling these images, and how it destroyed the lives of these kids forever and their parents. And I just would not give that one up. It was so deeply felt, the outrage and sense of righteous indignation on that. I was so repulsed by it. And this was all off the side of my desk. This wasn't my job. I was tracing these links to Europe, and then eventually I went to northern Romania, and I found these kids somehow and their parents and the guy who did it, and then came back and published the story. And it was used in court in Toronto to convict this Canadian distributor. That was a good day when that conviction came through.
I mean, you mentioned you're a father. How do you compartmentalize these stories so that you could say, this is my job, this is my calling, this is my mission, but as a human being, I have to let some of this go, because if it just all stays within you, you're in self, in fact, to be building up this toxic swamp that might change who you are.
It is compartmentalization, for sure. I talk to police officers about this a lot, how they do this. I think it happens over time. It is a reconciliation in the mind of what you are doing now is professional. And at 6 o'clock, when you walk in the front door, you hit the switch. You try and leave it behind. I'm not saying I always do. When I'm working on something pretty intense, my wife and my kid will tell me, short fuse, frustrated, distracted, and they call me out on it, and I try and recoup. It's a combination of a conviction in doing this particular type of work, and then also wanting to obviously be a good dad.
We often hear this concept of work-life balance, but when I find people that are pursuing something with a calling or with such passion or the importance of the outcome, it's almost impossible. At times you have to play act because you don't want necessarily work-life balance. You're in the middle of an investigation, and this is all that matters to you. How do you find sort of lessons to other people that might be listening? Because you really want to be back in the story, but at the same time, there's also demands to be that human being that someone married or a child you fathered.
It can make you insufferable. There's no question about it. All of this requires a certain psychosis. Like, none of this is healthy. I do the best that I can do. It is very immersive. You're not clocking out at 5 and filing your story and it's going into the paper the next day. You're working for months on something, and it's waking you up at 3 a.m. I also have this thing about when I know that I'm really inside of something, I have this thing where every morning at between 3 and 3:15, I wake up. Did I file that freedom of information request the right way? And how am I going to get that cop to meet me in the coffee shop in the morning? I mean, those can be weeks or months where you're going through that. There's no real fix on that. You either settle in and just acknowledge that you're going to be insufferable and do the best you can, or you stop doing it. Like, it's pretty binary. There's no real third option.
I've done a lot of interviews with people that have found a way to the top of their game in the creative process, not investigative journalism, but songwriting, performing. And I often wonder, should I have their partner on the show? Because you must give such credit to somebody that lives with somebody like you, because they know that when you check out, as much as they might try to build a bridge to you, they're going to have to wait until you put that drawbridge down.
It's a good idea. I think you should. I love my wife and my kids. It's not an easy path, for sure. And I feel guilt about it. That's the other thing. I feel deep guilt about it. In the moment, I'm not feeling guilt about it, right? Because I'm so distracted and focused on the thing. But then eventually it comes to a head and you're confronted with it. And at that moment, of course, you feel guilt. Of course. And then you try and make up for it. And you do the best you can. The orbit around you is filled with people who have to exercise some form of patience, and you yourself have to acknowledge that there is harm to this. There's repercussions, and you have to, in the moments where you can step out of it and it's over and you publish your story, in those moments, there is recompense.
One of the things I talked about in the opening is how I believe investigative journalism is not just the cornerstone of democracy, but the bedrock. And it's under threat because a lot of investigative journalism was funded by advertising. It was funded by this relationship between, the Procter & Gamble's that wanted eyeballs and the newspapers that knew a good investigative story drew eyeballs. And it was a marriage that worked well for years. But the commerce has changed. Advertising is now running to TikTok and snackable little pieces of content. How do we make sure that we continue as a society to elevate how important it is to spend at times months, if not a year, to expose the truth versus that snackable little soundbite that we seem to be all gravitating towards?
I, of course, believe that this work is vitally important. Journalism is a weight-bearing pillar of democracy. I believe it. We've heard it many times. Officials will say it. Politicians say it. Academics say it. But at the end of the day, that kind of grand message, I feel, is increasingly dusty and archaic and no longer holds kind of widespread public sway, I don't think. I think there is an acknowledgement that it's dying. There's no question it's dying. Like it's dramatic. In this country alone, like since 2008, the latest data, 530 journalism outlets have shut down. And the ones that continue to exist are a shadow of their former selves. They've been gutted. But I don't sense any widespread public concern or outrage about that. We are increasingly polarized. The information we get is fed and curated to reinforce the things that we already believe. We're all preaching to the individual choirs. There is no central marketplace of ideas, right? That's gone. That notion that there is a place where we gather every day, such as a newspaper or the evening news, and hear a collection of ideas and opinions and facts and thoughts from which we then sift through together, debate, and come to some higher form of conclusion about those things, which then reflects itself in legislation and public policy. That's over.
My hypothesis is investigative journalism has slipped away. It's become an opportunity to take a free rein on how I treat the public, our tax dollars, our borrowed dollars. What am I allowed to do and not do? Because we're not having, and even at the local newspaper with the local city hall, that if we don't have any kind of accountability, is it not an easy conclusion to say there's some people who will take advantage of that?
The halls of power, whether it be the city council or even at the provincial or federal level, the eyes and ears that used to be present, monitoring, writing about that, presenting to the public how governments are acting in our name. I mean, it's largely, particularly the municipal level, community level, it's largely gone entirely. And it's being deteriorated at the higher levels as well. A vacuum is created, right? And as with all vacuums, it must be filled. And so what's it being filled with? It's being filled with innuendo, opinion, fiction. Fiction is lovely. I mean, it's so easy to wake up in the morning and sit in your underwear and post to the internet your reflections on something you know nothing about. You've taken zero time or effort to actually understand the complexity and sophistication of these issues and post about it and just say, here's what I think, and name names and point fingers. And it's black and white. It's simple. It's polarizing. And we like that. It's instinctively reassuring to the human brain. The problem is it's fake. It's not true. Most of the time, it's not true. The world doesn't work that way. The world is not black and white. It's gray. It's texture. It requires context. And that's not what you're getting when you're relying solely on a feed fed by algorithms that are reinforcing what you already think.
When we return, Rob Cribb and I shift gears to really talk about why journalism matters. It's the only thing holding our leaders accountable. It's the only thing capable of pulling the truth from the shadows. And then I share a story about RBC and how much they matter to me. Hi, it's Tony Chapman from Chatter That Matters. The world's upside down and having peace of mind seems to be the exception versus the rule. RBC Wealth Management is hoping to change that. They don't have a crystal ball, but they do have a team of experts dedicated to working with you to preserve and grow your wealth and help you manage risk so that you can enjoy the rewards of your labor. Your peace of mind and financial health matters to RBC.
The fact that there's so much fakery going on is a real challenge. It's even a challenge for journalists. It's hard for us to figure out what's real and what's not real anymore. There is sophistication, the technology. It is easy to fake it. It is easy to lie. It is easy to successfully lie. I mean, as journalists, I think all we can do is tell the truth. Work hard, figure out what's real and what's not, and be open and transparent about how we do it.
My guest today is at the top of the investigative journalist game. He's a relentless seeker of the truth. Robert Cribb. I want to get back to your craft because I think we could spend the whole time just talking about the state of investigative journalism. I want to walk in your shoes. Is there times that you've done a story where you have to navigate the balance between exposing the truth and respecting ethical boundaries?
It requires a strong moral compass, for sure. We speak to lawyers, but at the end of the day, there's no real playbook that takes into account every scenario. It's complicated. Every story is different, and how you act and the methods you use in each story, you have to think about in an individual way. So I've done things like undercover reporting, which is always fraught ethically, without question. Dealing with whistleblowers, confidential sources. These are people that come to you with information which is often credible, but often also tainted by their own self-interest, right? Like why would people come to a journalist offering information? It's presumably, at least in part, because they have an axe to grind, and that's okay. I understand that. But what do you do, for example, if you receive information from a whistleblower, you're working with them, it's a confidential source relationship. And at some point during the course of your investigation, because you're going out widely, you're not just relying on what they give you, you're triangulating, right? You're testing that information, you're going to other people. What do you do, for example, if you determine that the information provided to you is false? What if it's made up? What if it's untrue? Or what if it's only a part of the picture? How do you treat that source to whom you've entered into some form of relationship or some sort of confidential source relationship, right? So those are tough.
I mean, I have to believe you build this relationship with a whistleblower. They feel that you're going to treat what they believe, their biases are true. They're going to believe that they are changing the world, and you come to a different conclusion. That's got to be an awkward conversation. Did they ever get surprised when they read it? You must get saying, how did you misinterpret everything I thought I was saying to you? Or
everybody knows what I'm going to write before I write it. That's one of the basic rules that we have, is that nobody doesn't know what's going to be in the paper. I go to everybody and all sides get fair comment and chance to respond. So they'll know, but it can be a very difficult conversation. In some cases, you would kill the story. In other cases, you find it isn't actually an important story and it needs to be told, but it's not going to be told in the way that the person thought it would be. And it may, in fact, be a story that is damaging reputationally to that person or to their interests or to the organization or whatever it might be. You have very few friends when you do this work, that's for sure.
You know, Hollywood has done an incredible job at portraying the investigative journalist and that tireless effort to seek the truth. But, you know, you mentioned lawyers, editors. How much bureaucracy gets involved where you feel at times you're writing in wet cement versus just wanting to move forward with what you believe is the truth?
I have never felt impeded in any way. I've been at the Toronto Star now for most of my career, 20-something years. And it's a paper that has been historically fearless in its reporting. Not one time. And I've done, I write stories about things that are controversial, things that in some cases advertisers don't like, et cetera. Not one. I mean, I can just tell you, not one time has anyone tapped me on the shoulder and said, you know what, why don't we ease off on this one? I think in Canada, that's typically true. When I speak with my friends and colleagues about this kind of thing, although, the truth is we've all often had for most of our careers and most of our histories, we've had a lot more money. We've had resources. We've had lawyers. It's changing. Our ability to defend ourselves now.
For my listeners, because we have a lot of people around the world, I mean, the Toronto Star is one of our major newspapers, and Toronto's obviously our major city. I would argue that as social media herded us to like-minded castles, is it fair to say that media has now deciding to change sides? I would go with the Fox as the first example of that, which saying we're just going to be all in on the right. Is it fair to say that even newspapers have become, I would say most of them existed some form a little bit left or a little bit right of center, but they're moving more to the fringes to attract a reader base?
I can speak about Canada, certainly, and say, no, I don't think that's true. I mean, the Toronto Star is left of center, moderate. Globe and Mail would be right of center, moderate. The Post, same. CBC, left, moderate, but the spectrum there in this country is not vast. I don't see that. Everyone is abiding by the same ethical rules of journalism: fairness, balance, accuracy, responsibility. I think that that's not the case here. Of course, I'm a consumer of the media in the United States, and I think it's a different thing. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two. Fox News and CNN. I was watching it a lot during, the election campaign, and it really struck me. There is nothing comparable in this country to that. I mean, it is absolute advocacy journalism. And I hesitate to use the word journalism. I mean, yeah, it's opinion. I mean, it's just a straight up opinion that seeks to find the alternative facts to buttress that viewpoint.
Part of the reason I do this show is to show that in this world of massive change, there's still ways to overcome circumstances, chase dreams. And when you do, you get to change your world, and often ours for the better. And, you mentioned, for example, the Panama Papers, which I would absolutely argue changed our world for the better. What advice would you give to young people that want to get into journalism? They've grown up as digital natives. They've created their content. They've gotten validation, not people protesting in front of a school like you found as a kid, but they might have had something that went online and got some virality. What advice would you give them to move beyond sort of that snackable content into journalism so that they could pursue a career and find the same sort of purpose and rewards that you found?
Maybe the greatest joy, I would say, in my career, just in the last 5 years, I've launched this nonprofit investigative center in Toronto. It's called the Investigative Journalism Bureau, and it's this remarkable place where young journalists come. These are, in some cases, people that I taught in university and journalism courses, and I've then hired them as interns, and then they come into the bureau, and now some of them are, long-time investigative reporters, and so they're some of the best in the country, well-trained, hungry, principled, want to make a difference. And when I see that, I mean, that's magic. And we publish these big, sprawling, hard-hitting investigations, and they see it, and they feel it, and I can see the synapses connecting in their brains, and they are so motivated. It is not a job for them. They truly, I see the same thing, I guess, that maybe somebody would have seen in me that day at the university when I showed up and saw the protests out front. I see it happening. We're training the next generation of investigative journalists at this place. I quit teaching a few years ago because honestly, it's uncomfortable. Journalism schools have an uncomfortable question that they have to answer existentially. What is it that we're doing, training all of these people for an industry that is collapsing? This kind of model, this thing that I've been working on and other people, this kind of nonprofit, altruistic, investigative model that digs deep, trains the next generation, and collaboratively works with people who we didn't traditionally work with. We bring in academics. Every project we have an academic lead or two, and they've shared with us data, and they do literature reviews with us, and we bring in grad students, and suddenly you build this tent and all this brain power enters it, and we can do far more in-depth, textured, contextual journalism than we ever did before. It's amazing.
Can this model also extend where we go to taxpayers and say, if we funded a non-for-profit, if we funded investigative journalism and what we deem to be the top topics that matter, isn't this a good thing to invest in?
it's taken a long time to build the model and then prove the model. We've proven it now. We've got years and years of front page, impeccable, hard-hitting reporting that's changed the world. We've impacted public policy, public discussion, public debate. I am now of the mind that this has to be the way forward. So we take the best of legacy media, the principles, the ethics, the methodology, the systematic approach, and we widen the tent. We bring in more people who are focused and have unique, narrow but deep knowledge in areas that we're looking at. We bring in the young people so that they can bring their perspective, but also an opportunity to build the skills and train them. And then we do two things simultaneously. We break new information that would have never been published otherwise. We go deeper with it. And we come out with these mission-driven, well-trained young journalists who are salivating over the prospects of doing this work well into the future and making our world better. Like, I am heartened by it. For the first time, really, in a long time, I actually think we're going to be okay, except that it's a real tough it's very difficult funding this as I'm learning. And the government funding is certainly one way to do it, but I don't think that's going to be the full answer. I don't think we're going to rely fully on governments for this. There has to be, as there is in the United States, there has to emerge some form of philanthropic interest in sustaining the survival of journalism in this country.
I think you're onto something for sure, because I think just putting money into the traditional media platforms is putting a Band-Aid on a festering wound. And what I love of what you're doing is if we can present this to the citizens, that this is the stories that matter. And whether it's philanthropy or crowdsourcing models or government, if we truly believe, like Jefferson and Walter Cronkite and Nelson Mandela and all the people that really have been beacons for democracy, that journalism is the lifeblood. It's the oxygen. It's what breathes the truth into what could very quickly become untruths.
And I think it's possible. But my worry is that it will take so long. There is a point, I think, of no return where it just collapses to a point where I just don't know that you can resuscitate. We're getting there. Journalistically, it's great. It's doing great. Everybody loves it. Everyone thinks it's incredible. But, it's very slow. It takes a long time to turn around the Titanic, as you know.
I also argue there's a lot of people that don't want that Titanic turned around.
I don't like those people.
There's a handful of people that are making an awful lot of money herding you into a castle with like-minded people and don't want you to have that conversation every evening where you're looking at a variety of stories and discussing stories and forming opinions that might be more into the middle than on the edges, because on the edges, there's been wealth created that's unprecedented in this society. We've never seen such wealth happen so quickly to a handful of people that have found a way that I don't really want you to think. I want you to sit in this pew and we're going to preach what we want to preach, and you're going to feel like you're contributing to it, because every 5 minutes you're going to get to sing with the choir, or what's called validation nowadays, or like something. It's as far away from facts as possible.
Well, you've just made the case, though, for the importance of sustaining and rebuilding this, because the core mission of investigative journalism in particular, and this is the credo that fills my day every day when I'm trying to decide, what am I going to do today? Where am I going to direct my attention today? It's the stories that speak truth to power. It's about holding power to account. I mean, that's the very thing that we're trying to do here. So if what we're talking about is the loss of that work, the people who get up every day and ask those difficult questions and pore through the court documents and spend countless hours gathering the data and analyzing it to try and pull together the answer to that question. How is it that we're going to hold the powerful institutions that act upon us to greater account? If we're all going to agree that it's not important enough to sustain, well, you think it's bad now? Just hold on a minute.
I always end my podcast with my 3 takeaways. And the interesting one, and it's always about human journeys, is that girl that you chased into the newspaper realm and fell in love with investigative journalism, and how that journey now is driving into a point of society where you might be tapped on the shoulder saying, Rob, maybe is no longer your calling to do investigative journalism. Maybe it's to lead investigative journalism into the future. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens if we can society can provide the economy to allow this non-for-profit to seek the truth. The second thing that I really like is this simple expression, but I want everybody to just think about it all day. Society's moved to saying, I'm either black or white, but the world doesn't operate that way. The world operates in the world of gray. And within those gray, there's a lot of times we've got to shine lights on to see what is really going on. And the third one is just for people out there, we all seek our calling. We all seek something that has such purpose and passion. And I would argue an addiction that we wake up at 3 a.m. like Rob did and thinking about it. And it comes with a price. Understand that when you find that, there's a price. There's a price to you mentally. There's a price to you physically. More importantly, there's a price to the people that you love, because they have to understand that when you go into those weeds, whether it's holding an electric guitar on stage and playing, writing, creating, being a criminal justice, it comes with a price. And that price is the people that want you to succeed, but at the same time, need and deserve and want a piece of you. So, Rob, for all of this and more, this has been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate you joining me.
You're a thoughtful guy. Thanks for asking me. I appreciate it.
I apologize. My voice is a little hoarse, but I wanted to share the story about RBC. 2020, started the pandemic. I pitched RBC an idea about focusing on small business owners. Each week we share a story of somebody overcoming circumstances, and then we invite 3 experts to help that business. Someone from RBC, and then 2 people from my Rolodex. People like Arlene Dickinson and Joe Mimran and Jeannie Becker and so many more. It's a great series. You go back early in our tape, you'll love it. But I just wanted to point out that one of the things that impressed me even back then, and this was with Armin Haska, who was one of my first contacts, and he said, at RBC, we invest in Canadian journalism. We know it's not going to get us the same clicks that you might get on a Facebook. We know how important it is. And if we're a bank that's going to focus on more than money, focus on what really matters to Canadians, then we got to make sure we have a strong journalistic community. So hats off to RBC for focusing on the things that matter and the things that can make our country so much better. Once again, a special thanks to RBC for supporting Chatter That Matters. It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening, and let's chat soon.